The fictional planet Dune is so incredibly hot that it can reach 160 degrees during the day, and where water is so scarce that it can be measured in human lives.
Each one of these drinks every day the equivalent of 5 men, 20 palm trees, 100 lives.
Hi, I'm Michael Wyetzner, and I've been an architect for over 35 years. Today, we're going to explore how the architecture of Dune teaches us the difference between adapting to an environment and just surviving it. Dune mostly takes place on the desert planet of Arrakis. And on this planet, there is a little mouse who is adapted to the extreme conditions of the desert. In the world of Dune, that mouse is called Muad'Dib, and there are a few interesting notes about that name. It actually comes from the Arabic word for a tutor or teacher. It's also the chosen common name of Paul Atreides, which shows us that he intends to learn from the desert and not impose his ways upon it. So first, let's take a look at Arrakeen. And it is clear from the scale of this building that it is not here to make friends. It is here to dominate. In the book, it is described as the largest structure ever built by man, which is obviously inspired by the pyramids of Giza, which was like the largest building in the world for like 3,800 years. Let's get a closer look at the palace. Okay, so here's everything that jumps out at me. You can see how everything is sloped to deflect the wind from all the sandstorms. And the entire complex appears to be made out of poured-in-place concrete. There's a definite lack of windows, which is done to control the solar heat gain inside the building. So they obviously want to let some natural light inside the building, but the heat is so intense that they have to control it, and they use these massive concrete planes that are pivoted to close off the heat from getting inside.
My lord, the sun's getting too high. We need to seal the doors.
They use other strategies to control the heat, like light wells and screens. And these screens are known as jali, which were used historically throughout Middle Eastern architecture to allow the light in and yet mitigate the heat. According to the production designers, they were inspired by Egyptian pyramids and also Aztec pyramids and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. And the main palace, on closer inspection, is inspired by the Pyramid of the Sun in Mexico. In addition to the Pyramid of the Sun, there was also the Pyramid of the Moon. But more on the moon later. You can clearly see these influences, but at the same time, this takes place 8,000 years in the future, and it reminds me of some more modern architectural and artistic influences also. One artist's work this reminds me of is Michael Wyetzner, who created this amazing piece of land art in the middle of the desert in Nevada, which he called just plainly City. And what's interesting is Wyetzner was the son of an anthropologist who actually worked in Mexico. And these pieces that he constructed in the desert in Nevada are clearly influenced by the pyramids there. And it's really interesting that it's called City, because if you look at it from above in some of these wide-angle shots, it looks very similar to what they did for the sets on Dune. So to give you an idea of the scale of what Michael Wyetzner built in the desert, it took over 200 acres in the middle of the desert, and it took him 50 years to build it. But in addition to Michael Wyetzner, I also want to talk about Carlo Scarpa, the great Italian architect, who also built in concrete. And he used board-formed concrete. And it reminded me a lot of what we saw in the palace. So to build out of concrete, you essentially have to build twice. First, you have to build the forms or the mold that you're going to pour the liquid concrete into. They used to build concrete forms out of wooden boards before plywood came along. And each board would leave an impression in the concrete, which you could clearly see in these images from Arrakeen, and you could also clearly see from these images of the buildings that Carlo Scarpa built. So it's curious that 8,000 years in the future, they're still building out of board-formed concrete. So Scarpa was known to be a very, very sensitive architect, and he had a great sense of materiality, and he would put a very fine material next to a very rough material, which is also done by some other architects like Louis Kahn and Rem Koolhaas. But Scarpa had this very poetic way of combining materials. He also had a great sense of natural light and how to manipulate that light. And the other thing he did, which you could clearly see in some of the details in Arrakeen, is he would sort of do these concentric forms. He would step things back, almost like the tympanum at the entrance to a Gothic church. In a more basic sense, because everything here is built out of concrete, it's very reminiscent of brutalism, the architecture style from the 60s and 70s. And while concrete at first seems to be a perfect material for withstanding the desert environment, to build it, you actually need water, and a lot of it. So the idea that the largest building ever was built out of concrete, which requires water, a massive amount of water, while people are dying of thirst seems like the height of arrogance. Of course, the desert of Dune is wildly different from the wet and lush world that Paul has arrived from. And what really drives home this point is when Paul tells Zendaya's character about swimming, because she can't imagine that much water in one place.
When you see sand here, imagine water. If you dive in, it's called swimming.
I don't believe you.
So let's take a look at Paul's homeworld, Caladan. So here's everything that jumps out at me. So the big difference here is that this environment and this climate is very different. They're trying to bring light into the space, and they're doing so through the use of these circular openings. And these circular openings in Chinese architecture are known as moon gates. So moon gates traditionally were used in Chinese architecture to enter into a garden, and they were very symbolic of the idea of passing from one world into another world, the transition between one space into another space. And so I think there's an implied symbolism here of the transition that Paul is about to undertake. The first time we see Paul Atreides in the film is through one of these moon gates. And also the first time Paul learns about Arrakis, we see him through a moon gate again. And the first time he meets the Bene Gesserit for his test, he passes through one of these moon gates. And he even receives a warning from his family physician in Mandarin Chinese, which is maybe a subtle nod to the architectural symbolism of this scene. Circles continue to appear as a motif throughout the film, including the spaceships that fold space and time, and even the mouth of the sandworm Shai Hulud. Interestingly, the name of the sandworms, Shai Hulud, is also inspired from the Arabic. Shai comes from Shayun, which means thing, and Hulud roughly means immortality or eternity, which is also another symbolic meaning of the circle. And now let's talk about the architecture of the native people, the Fremen. Here's everything that jumps out at me. What I love is that it appears to be just carved out of the mountain. And it's at a massive scale. You could see the size of a figure standing right here in front of what appears to be this huge entrance, but in fact is sort of just symbolic of the entrance, with the real human-scaled entrance recessed here within this deep channel. And then they also have this big slot of a horizontal window here. The idea is to control the light, which controls the heat. And then what's also sort of curious are these series of paired circular openings, which obviously are either vents or some sort of small window. So what I really like about carving it out of the mountain is you're not bringing in trees to make forms and water to make concrete. You're using what's already in the environment and making something out of that. You're adapting to the environment instead of bringing something else to it, which is the height of sustainability. So what I really like is that it's very reminiscent of the buildings that were carved out of the walls of the canyon at the ancient city of Petra in Jordan. So in the film, the name for these Fremen villagers are called Siches, but according to the author, it's pronounced CH. And in fact, the word Sich or CH is very similar to the word Al-Sik in Arabic, which is the name of the narrow canyon that leads to the city of Petra. So this spectacular sandstone city of Petra was built by the Nabateans in the 3rd century BC, where they carved temples, tombs, and stables into the soft stone cliffs. And in an interesting parallel to the film, it is said that Petra was created by Moses when his staff struck the rock that brought forth water to the Israelites. And in the book, like Moses, Paul is considered to be a liberator who will bring the Fremen people to freedom. So there are other examples of how the Fremen and their architecture have adapted to the desert, such as the fabric tents that we see later in the film. So the various tent constructions in the film appear to reference real-world desert cultures, such as the traditional tent of the nomadic Bedouin people who call the deserts of the Middle East their home. These tents are called Beit al-Shar, which literally translates to house of hair. So the thing about these traditional tents is that they were very suited to their environment because they were light and transportable. They were made out of animal hair. They allowed the breeze to flow through when it was dry. And the fibers would swell up and prevent the water from coming through, and the oil would shed the water from the roof when it was wet, although that's not really a concern for Arrakis. By living and adapting to an extreme climate like this, the people settling there are forced to come up with new and innovative designs. So that's just some of the architecture from part 1 of Dune. If you want to see a breakdown of the architecture in part 2, let us know in the comments below.